Hey there, pirates. Welcome aboard the Anime No Me channel. What if Zoro ate a devil fruit? I know. The guy's already a monster on his own. He's a force of nature, with just his arms, his willpower, and that stubborn head that gets lost even with a compass. But hear me out. What if out of nowhere, he ended up eating a fruit that was truly his? Like fate had left it there, waiting, a fruit that wouldn't erase who he is, but would amplify him to the ridiculous level we all know he can reach? Because let's be honest, Zoro never needed a fruit. He's the guy who trained to the brink of losing his arms with Mihawk, who took on all of Luffy's damage at Thriller Bark without saying a word. Someone who respects his body, his discipline, his honor, so much that he might even see eating a fruit as a kind of weakness. But here's the catch. What if it's not weakness? What if it's evolution? What if the fruit is the missing piece for him to break his final limit? That barrier between the legendary and the mythic? I keep thinking about this ever since I saw his Ashura form for the first time in Eni's lobby, chapter 418. That was already something from another world. 3 heads, 6 arms, a presence no one could quite explain. Sanji asks what that was. Frankie doesn't understand. And Zoro himself gives no answer, because maybe he doesn't even know. Maybe that was the seed of a fruit that was never eaten, but already lives inside him. As if the universe were saying, you can reach it, just one more step. And so I imagine, what would that fruit be? And no, it wouldn't be just some random mythical zone. I'm not talking about turning Zoro into a 3-sword tiger or anything like that. It would be a fruit that respects who he already is. One that amplifies what he holds most sacred, the blade, the focus, the spirit. Maybe a paramecia that lets him multiply swords through sheer willpower. Maybe he can summon styles that exist only in the mind. Maybe he could even create slashes that extend through time, not just space. Look at chapter 1010, for example, when Zoro manages to wound Kaido. That wasn't just anything, that was a milestone. He cut someone that Luffy only managed to reach after awakening the power of the Sun God. And Zoro did it with brute strength, haki, and a cursed sword. Now imagine if he had a fruit that connected him to the spiritual world of blades, a fruit that brought to life the swords he's lost along the way, like Wado Ichimonji in ethereal form, or Shusui appearing when he needs it most, like a shadow answering the call of his heart. And I think this fruit wouldn't be a reward, it would be a responsibility, because Zoro doesn't want shortcuts. He never has. He wants to be the greatest swordsman, and for him, that's more about a promise than power. He made a vow to Luffy back in chapter 6, right at the start, and since then, he's never backed down, never hesitated. He'd rather fall alone than let Luffy lose faith. Now imagine if on one of these journeys, he was forced to eat a fruit to protect someone, not out of vanity, not to feel stronger, but because it was the only way to stop Luffy from losing someone again. Maybe it'd be something like the Sabaody situation when Kizaru shows up and they get crushed in chapter 512. Zoro could barely stand, and even then he was there, trying to rise, spitting blood, saying he'd fight to the end. That's the kind of guy he is, and that's the kind of scenario that could bend fate. A fruit showing up out of nowhere as a last resort. Something he doesn't want, but needs. Something that sticks to him like an invisible scar. And then, boom, the world changes. Maybe the fruit would be called something like Yomi Yomi no Mi too. Not the same as Brooks, but a blade version. A fruit that allows him to cut what cannot be cut. One that's tied to the spirit. Slashes that pass through souls. An ethereal sword that wounds what even haki cannot touch. Or maybe a fruit that forges swords out of will. A slash that grows with the user's resolve. Imagine Zoro with something like that. A cut born from the desire to protect. And it's not just about strength, it's about symbolism. Because Zoro is someone who's already nearly at the level of gods, just through training. And if the world requires him to go further, it won't be for glory. It will be out of necessity. Because there are enemies that can only fall to forces that transcend the physical, like Imu perhaps, or someone from the Gorosei, beings that are no longer men, that don't follow normal rules. That's when Zoro would need something else. Something that expands his haki, his bond with swords, his warrior soul. And I look at how Oda writes Zoro, everything is so deliberate. When he trains with Mihawk in chapter 597, he barely says a word. He just bows, and that says everything. He understands he needs to grow. But he only accepts growth if it comes through sacrifice, through pain, through responsibility. So if fate throws a fruit in front of him, and if that fruit is the key to fulfilling his promise to Luffy, he might accept it, but only if it's out of love. Love for the dream, love for the captain, love for that blue-haired girl who fell crying in the dojo years ago, saying she wanted to be strong. Now it's time to think about what would really change. Because if Zoro ate a devil fruit, and I'm not talking just any fruit, but the one that feels like it was made for him, like the world itself had been saving it for the right moment, then there's no way things stay the same. Because even without meaning to, even without changing who he is, Zoro would become becomes someone who represents a new era. Not just Luffy's right hand, but a kind of living sword, a balance between what the world was and what it's about to become. And at that point, I think the impact of it would shake up way more than we imagine. First of all, the crew itself. Let's imagine, just for a moment, that Zoro eats this fruit during a crisis. A moment where Luffy is about to lose someone, or maybe even being defeated right in front of the crew. Something like the scenes from chapter 1009 onward, when everything's falling apart at Onigashima, and Kaido's firing off sky-splitting blows. In a moment like that, it's not hard to picture Zoro, in silence, making that decision. Saying nothing, just grabbing the fruit and eating it, because it's the only way. And when he rises again with something new in his eyes, something even Sanji doesn't recognize, that's when the world gives a subtle tremble. Because now, this man carries a power not just tied to his sword, but to the spirit behind every single cut. And that's when everything starts to change. The first thing that might happen is that Sanji himself would start to get suspicious. Not out of envy or jealousy, because Sanji is better than that, but because he understands the crew's balance. He knows that he and Zoro are the two pillars that support the weight of Luffy's decisions. And if one of them changes too much, the other feels it. So if Zoro starts to manifest abilities involving dimensional slashes, spiritual summoning, or even the materialization of the swords he lost, Sanji would become more alert. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Because Sanji also understands that too much power without control can become something else. Then comes the emotional side. Luffy. How would he react to seeing Zoro going so far for him? I think at first, Luffy would smile because Luffy believes in his friends. But deep inside, he might get quieter because Luffy hates seeing others sacrifice themselves. He's never liked the idea of someone paying too high a price for him. And if Zoro eats a fruit to save him, maybe Luffy would stay silent for a while. Not out of anger, but because he understands what that means. Zoro crossed a line, and now he carries something no one else can carry. And this also affects his relationship with Mihawk, because Zoro's dream hasn't changed. He still wants to be the greatest swordsman in the world. But now he has something that separates him from the other swordsmen, a fruit that the world might not accept as pure. Some people will say, now it's easy, the guy has a devil fruit. And Zoro will have to fight against that too, because he doesn't want shortcuts. He wants to be recognized, not for being a swordsman with magical powers, but for still cutting better than anyone else. That might lead him into an internal crisis. Like, will Mihawk still accept this duel? Will he still see Zoro as worthy of being his successor? Maybe yes, maybe number, but the most likely is that Mihawk will accept it, because he saw a warrior in Zoro from the beginning. And if he ate a fruit, it was because the world demanded it of him. Not out of vanity, but out of duty. And that Mihawk understands better than anyone. Now, let's talk about the more global consequences. Because a Zoro with a fruit like that is no longer just the right hand of the future Pirate King. He becomes one of the most dangerous beings in the world. Maybe the world government starts ranking him at the same threat level as an admiral, maybe even higher. Because if his fruit is connected to spiritual cuts, or something that harms even what can't be seen, then he becomes a threat to Imu, to the Gorosei, to everything that hides in the shadows. And that could become a problem, because just like Luffy is the sun, Zoro becomes the blade of the sun, the warrior who protects the light against everything that crawls in the darkness. He won't just cut ships or monsters anymore. He'll cut concepts, he'll cut lies, he'll cut illusions. And in a world like One Piece, that's too much power. Then I start imagining how Brook would react, because he also has a connection to the spiritual world. Maybe he'd feel something different in Zoro. Maybe he'd hear a new voice when Zoro uses his new slashes. Something that resembles the presence of someone who shouldn't be there. Maybe Kuina, maybe the essence of the Wado Ichimonji gains a kind of voice. Maybe Zoro's slashes start to echo sounds that only those who've touched the border of life can hear. Like Brook, like those who've crossed to the other side and come back. And that could even affect Zoro's own haki. Maybe he awakens something beyond, a kind of haki that reacts to the fruit, a haki of the pure blade. Something that allows him to cut even the chains of fate if necessary. Because if he eats this fruit, he's not just fighting with strength anymore, he's fighting with the weight of what it means. Every time he draws his sword, he carries promises, dreams, cries, memories. And then, of course, there's the question of the end. If Zoro eats this fruit, and if it's as powerful as it seems, then maybe he becomes one of the guardians of the new world. When Luffy claims the One Piece, when the world begins to turn differently, maybe Zoro stays there between the old and the new, a samurai guarding the frontier, a man who, in silence, watches the sun rise, sword in hand, ready to cut down anything that threatens what his captain has built. That was today's content. We hope you liked it and want to share your opinion on the subject. Don't forget to share the video, give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care and stay amazing.